Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, John Rees. Israeli military operations in the West Bank are continuing to escalate tensions in the region. Israel claims the military action is in response to the kidnapping of 3 Israeli boys. So far, Israel's use of the army has left at least 2 Palestinians dead and over 330 imprisoned. Concern regarding Israel's response to the kidnapping has been voiced across the political spectrum. It's perceived by many as both a violation of human rights and as a collective punishment of the Palestinians. It's yet to be confirmed whether or not Hamas is involved in the kidnapping, as the Israeli government has alleged. But is Israel's response to the kidnapping fair, proportionate or even legal? Joining me to discuss this are Tony Cadman, an international law specialist in the field of war crimes and human rights, Martin Linton, former Labour MP and founder of Labour to Palestine, and Ben White, a British journalist and expert in Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. Before we turn to discussion though, let's take a look at this report.
Nearly 2 weeks have passed since 3 Israeli teenagers, Natlafi, Frankiel, Ayal, Yifrah, Gilad Shaar, were discovered missing by Israeli authorities, a development that has resulted in one of the largest-scale military operations since the Palestinian Intifada in 2000.
Contact was lost during the late night hours with 3 youths in the Gush Etzion region, and since early morning we were busy with a military operation to search for them.
The noose is tightening on President of the National Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed to hold him and the recently formed unity government responsible for the missing teenagers. The United Nations initially condemned the attacks, but recanted their statements after Farhan Haq, deputy spokesman for the UN General Secretary Ban Ki-moon, averred the UN could not verify the alleged kidnappings. The disappearance of the 3 teenagers, last seen hitchhiking near the settlement of Yeshiva in the West Bank, has driven Israeli authorities to ensure their return at any cost, primarily in the form of a large-scale offensive of an unprecedented and unforeseen magnitude.
And the kidnapping was carried out by Hamas members. Hamas denials do not change this fact.
Benjamin Netanyahu has been quick in pointing the finger at Hamas, which Israeli security officials allege are behind the disappearance of the young men, a move analysts have described as the crushing of Palestine's newly formed unity government. The incriminate crackdown on Palestinian villages across the West Bank and in Gaza has turned the climate of skepticism into outright cynicism, after 4 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces during Operation Brother's Keeper. Ahmed Sabri, 20 years old, Mohammed Dudin, 15 years old, Mustafa Hosni Aslan, 22 years old, and Ahmed Saad Saoud Khalid, 27 years old. As speculations continue to colour perceptions held by high-ranking Israeli officials, Israeli human rights organisations and the international community have come under attack for failing to supplement accusations that pin the blame on Hamas. The aim, as various analysts have pronounced, is to dismantle, smear and discredit the Palestinian Unity government. The Israeli army is yet to comment on these recent developments. Among those expressing concern is the Times of Israel, publishing an article earlier today asking if Israel's operations to find kidnapped teens amounts to a war crime. In light of these events, a Facebook page calling for the murder of a Palestinian for every hour the 3 Israeli boys remain missing was created. Independent reporters have found the Israeli army to be behind the electronic offensive, and despite of efforts to close down the page, it is presently liked by 20,761 followers. The page urges Israeli Prime Minister to take responsibility instead of holding Mahmoud Abbas and the unity government responsible, Palestinian Ma'an news agency reported last week. Whilst the search for the missing teens torpedoes across Palestinian villages and homes, widespread evidence suggests Israeli operations are tantamount to the collective punishment of Palestinians. Here are hundreds of Palestinians partaking in the funeral procession of a 15-year-old boy, Mohammed Dudin, who was killed last Friday during search operations. Since, an estimated 1,150 sites inhabited by Palestinians have thus far been searched, raising serious questions regarding the legality, efficacy, and standardization of these operations. 2 weeks on, and Israel has yielded nothing more than 330 arrests, claimed the lives of 3 children, and compelled Palestinian president to issue a statement condemning the Israeli state for using the missing teens as a pretext to besiege Palestinians. In retort to these recent events, former member of the Knesset and journalist Avraham Burg summarized the last 66 years of Israeli occupation as the kidnapping of Palestinian society. Reports flooding in over the weekend suspect Netanyahu's policy of selective neutrality and association by guilt could potentially spark a third intifada with the proliferation of illegal settlements, aerial bombardment in Gaza, and economic strife. But is Israel's recent offensive in breach of international laws, and is the sheer scale of the attack warranted in absence of evidence to substantiate the alleged kidnappings? Will the international community act in preventing further bloodshed, or continue to purport false notions of parity? Nazli Tazi, Islam Channel.
So, Martin, what do you make of this response by the Israelis? I mean, we're used to a disproportionate response, but this seems extreme even by Israeli standards.
Well, I mean, obviously the nominal reason is to find the kidnappers. But in fact, if you look at the things that they've done, most of the things they've done couldn't help them in any way to find the kidnappers. I mean, stopping prisoners from seeing television, arresting MPs, re-arresting people who've been arrested and released just recently, deporting people from the West Bank to Gaza. I mean, none of these things have to do with the kidnap itself. And even when you look at the arrests, I think the latest figure is 471. None of these seem to have helped them in any way to find the kidnappers. So I think the only conclusion is that the Palestinian Authority is right when they say that it's an exercise in collective punishment. And personally, I think that the ultimate objective of this wave of arrests is actually to undermine the reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas. That's what they're trying to achieve at the end of the day.
Toby, is it legal?
Well, no, and it's not a legitimate response. I mean, as we've just heard, none of this is really aimed at identifying the kidnappers or trying to identify the 3 boys who've been abducted. It is of concern when you hear statements from the government that they have information who's responsible and they're going to be releasing it to various countries. Well, why is this not part of a credible criminal investigation? So once again, we're seeing a heavy-handed response, which is retributive more than anything else. And we only look at it with concern. These are, once again, grave human rights violations by the Israelis.
What is the legal framework which would govern this, and what would the Israeli state be doing if it were working within that framework?
Well, it's a matter under Israeli law, but of course they are bound by certain international norms that are not being respected, which is a matter that we're repeatedly seeing. There are allegations being raised of administrative detention being used in large numbers. There are individuals being targeted for particular allegiances where there is no credible criminal investigations being carried out. And that's the concern. If they have information as to who's responsible, then they should be processed before a court of law.
Ben, how out of the frame of a normal Israeli response is this, or is it just part of ongoing operations?
I think they've tried to take advantage of the situation to pursue some objectives that they would consider strategic to pursue. Martin mentioned already the aim of trying to drive a wedge between Fatah and Hamas and unbalance the unity government. And there was also a desire within parts of the military to do
And that would work how? By essentially saying Hamas are to blame for this and trying to drive a wedge between the 2 parties on that basis?
Yes, although one might add actually that there's been sort of an element that they might not have predicted that, which is demonstrations of anger by Palestinians targeting the Palestinian Authority itself, particularly in Ramallah, where Palestinians have seen Israeli troops come into the city and have seen PA forces also attacking Palestinians, as well as, of course, Israeli forces with more deadly violence. But that's one of the aims. Another aim has been to, quote-unquote, clean up cities or refugee camps where the Israelis have seen increased resistance to occupation in sort of recent months and maybe sort of going back over a year or more. So, for example, in Jenin and Nablus, there was sort of a general desire that existed before the kidnapping to go in and sort of do a sweep of areas that they deem to be problematic.
So Martin, if there's some tensions now, as Ben's suggesting, with the authority, is the Israeli plan working? Is it liable to destabilise the government?
Well, I don't think it's working in terms of driving a wedge between Fatah and Hamas, because the President Abbas, who is, of course, a member of Fatah, has said quite clearly that he doesn't believe. He has no evidence to say that Hamas is involved. He doesn't believe that they are. But if they were, he would clearly end the agreement over the joint government. I think they want to go. I think, as Ben says, they have more than one objective. First objective is to destabilise this joint government, but they also want to prove to or show to the Americans that Hamas is still a terrorist organisation. And they also want to send a message to the US and to Britain, indeed, that they shouldn't recognise Palestine, because I think that's one of the things they fear is going to happen quite soon as a result of the collapse of the talks, is that some of the Western countries that abstained on the issue of recognising Palestine will now say, well, that's it, we're going to recognise Palestine.
Why is it that the Israeli state now fears a sort of united Palestinian government? I mean, in one way it sounds an odd question, but the unity this time has been produced by, in part, changes in Egypt, making Hamas's position weaker. So one reading of it might be that this unity is a kind of moderating effect on Hamas, and yet it still seems to be of massive concern for the...
Well, it's very revealing, I think, that this country that always tells us it's the only democracy in the Middle East, when Palestine announces they're going to have a reconciliation and have an interim government and have elections in 6 months' time, what do the Israelis do? Do they support it? Do they welcome it? No. They do everything they can to obstruct it. And the only conclusion I can draw from that, tell me if there is another one available, is that they don't want Palestinians to have elections. They don't want Palestinians to have a credible united government, and they want to have Hamas as a demon, to prove to the rest of the world that they are justified in refusing to speak to the Palestinians, or refusing to speak to come up with a reasonable peace plan.
Toby, is there any form of legal redress? We've got a state acting in an extra legal way. It's very rare for the Israelis to be criticised by the Western powers in the way that some other states would be if they behaved like this. But is there any form of remote chance of legal redress here, or paths that could be followed?
Well, one of the discussions that has been taking place, and a lot more so recently, is the International Criminal Court being the correct forum to deal with these particular types of abuses. What we're talking about is widespread systematic crimes being committed against civilian population. I mean, these are clearly matters that fall within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. Regrettably, the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction is very limited in scope and can only deal with matters where countries have signed up to it. Whilst we are seeing the flotilla case being dealt with by the International Criminal Court.
This is the Mavi Marmara case?
That's correct. But that's because the ships that were attacked were registered to a state that is a state party to the International Criminal Court, and Israel is not. That means that only the UN Security Council can refer the situation in Palestine to the ICC, and of course we know that will never happen. The US will veto any attempts. And when we saw recently the adoption of a number of international treaties by Palestine, this received a great deal of criticism, particularly by the US, because there is this deep-rooted concern that any investigations into these types of matters would destabilise the whole process, which, in my view, is utterly ridiculous.
I mean, these kind of collective punishments, I mean, the kind of international opprobrium attached to that kind of behaviour goes back at least to the way in which the Nazis treated occupied powers in the Second World War, and further back than that. And there's no other frame of reference within which those can be dealt with.
No, regrettably, you can take matters before different parts of the United Nations. For example, there is a special procedures branch in Geneva that deals with human rights violations, but their powers are very, very limited. Now, arguably, you could bring cases under what we call universal jurisdiction, bringing criminal cases before courts in a national jurisdiction, courts in this country. If we can isolate matters that constitute torture and other acts prohibited under international law, there is a duty to deal with those matters before national courts. So there's no reason why these matters couldn't be brought before the British courts. But as we saw a few years ago when there was attempts to arrest certain high-ranking officials, Israeli officials, then the law was amended in this country that now you have to have the Attorney General's, the Director of Public Prosecution's approval before you can seek an arrest. So there have been, there are political games being played, but that doesn't mean that these matters should not be pursued, and in my view, they should be pursued.
But I mean, if the legal redress is at least, shall we say, very difficult to come by, this is more political damage to the Israeli state at a time when, do you think it's more diplomatically isolated than most people can remember, perhaps?
I think that's true to an extent, and I think also Israel is trying to work out how to best spin the collapse in the peace talks, and I think that again was part of its motivation for wanting to highlight the unity government as being particularly problematic and wanting to quote-unquote blame the Palestinians for obstacles to talks continuing. Obviously there's also increased momentum within BDS movement and boycott and divestment initiatives of different sorts. So certainly the sorts of coverage that has been seen in international media, albeit not as much as we would like, about Israeli attacks. And actually, just for the sake of clarity, as far as I'm aware, there's been 4 Palestinians killed by the use of live ammunition over the last sort of 10 days or so, with a 5th in intensive care. And most people, when they see that kind of response, where Israeli military officials are briefing Israeli media that what's going on here is much broader than a search for kidnapped teens, and even in some contexts might make the initial effort more problematic than it needs to be. I think most people, when they look at that, they draw the same sort of conclusion as people draw when they look at the apartheid wall, with the anniversary of the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion, the 10-year anniversary coming up soon, and they realise that the only way that you can make a state like Israel end its systematic human rights abuses is by pressure. I mean, Martin, do you see this as another incident which is going to increase the isolation of the Israeli state? Because we've seen a remarkable shift in public opinion probably in the last decade or so in favour of the Palestinians and against the state of Israel. Yes,
I mean, public opinion in this country is now something like, among those who have an opinion, something like 2 to 1 on the side of the Palestinians, as to say they're more sympathetic to the Palestinians than the Israelis. Which is the reverse
of a situation as recently as 10 years ago, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. And the politicians are gradually catching up with the public on this, I think, and more are expressing sympathy for the Palestinians. More and more Conservative MPs as well are now expressing those views. I think what has really tipped the balance with a lot of people is the gratuitous Israeli announcement of new settlement projects whenever any possibility of progress on the peace talks occurred. I mean, it was just when an American politician would come over, they would announce some more, and when it looked as though the peace talks might succeed, they would announce some more. And it's clear that announcing more settlements has nothing to do with Israeli security. It's just Israeli desire for more land. And there's no way that you can hide the expansion of settlements inside the West Bank as to protect the Israelis because it actually gives them less security rather than more. So I think more and more people have come to the clear conclusion that they are trying to torpedo the peace talks, and they're insincere when they take part. We are now seeing governments beginning to take seriously the idea, not of sanctions in the traditional sense, but of taking measures against the Israeli settlements. Already the British government has taken one small step saying that we do not encourage trade with settlements. I hope that they will then move on to say they discourage trade with settlements, that they advise companies against trading with settlements, that they would take measures against large British companies like G4S who do a lot of work in the West Bank with the wall and with prisons, and eventually that they would themselves say that since they've been saying for the last few years endlessly that the settlements are illegal, and the next stage is to say that trading with the settlements is also illegal.
Ben, do you think that also there's a sense in which Israeli foreign policy is dislocated because Western policy in the region is dislocated? I mean, in the last week, we've moved from a situation which, only 18 months ago, this government was discussing with the Americans whether or not to bomb Iran. Now they're their ally in the, in the chaos of Iraq. Do you think that this sort of dislocation of foreign policy is disconcerting the Israelis?
I think that Israel's approach to events happening in the region, whether very close to home, such as Syria, or further away, such as in Iran and Iran's talks and ongoing nuclear negotiations, I think Israel's approach to that reflects its approach that it also takes to the Palestinians and has taken for a long time, which is effective sort of unilateral strength. So when Israel looks at what's happening around it, it will take the approach that, we have to sort of bunker down in our fortress, be prepared for any eventuality. It wants to thwart and discourage any sort of rapprochement between Tehran and countries in the West, including the US. And its approach towards the Palestinians is the same sort of unilateralism. It defines what it wants to achieve in a particular circumstance. It sets its own sort of quote-unquote red lines, and those red lines are things like, preventing the implementation of international law, securing land and natural resources, and preventing Palestinian sovereignty and Palestinian return, all these sorts of things, and gets on with how it sees it possible to achieve those aims. And of course, until now, it has support, either explicit or implicit, from countries in the West and elsewhere in pursuing that kind of path. But I think, particularly under the Netanyahu government, that kind of policy of unilateral violence and of unilateral colonization is starting to come unstuck, in the sense that the global climate towards Israel is changing. The climate towards Israel amongst a lot of different groups in civil society, as well as at the political level, is changing. And that kind of unilateralism, that sort of rogue state behavior, is liable to get Israel, produce Israel ever more isolated and ever more the target of the types of BDS-type strategies and problems that we've seen so far.
OK, I'm going to have to stop you there because we've come to the end of part one. But of course, it's not just Israeli children that go missing in this area. Many hundreds of Palestinian children also go missing, and we'll be discussing that issue after the break. Do rejoin us.